You spend 20 moves building a winning position. You survive the opening. You navigate the middle game. You avoid tactical mistakes. Your opponent is hanging on by a thread. Then somehow, the game ends in a draw. Not because you blundered a queen. Not because you missed a checkmate. Not because your opponent outcalculated you. You simply didn't know the endgame. This happens far more often than most players realize. At every level of chess, players throw away winning positions because they reach an endgame they don't understand. The good news is that you don't need to memorize hundreds of complicated positions. You only need a small number of fundamental ideas. Learn these concepts, and you'll instantly become more dangerous whenever the pieces start disappearing. Today we're covering the only chess endgames most players actually need to know. King activity. Most beginners spend the entire game protecting their king, and during the opening and middle game, that's exactly what you should do. But endgames are different. Once queens and major pieces disappear, your king transforms from a liability into a weapon. Imagine two identical positions, same pawns, same material, same opportunities. The only difference is the king. In one position, the king sits passively on the back rank. In the other, the king marches toward the center. The active king almost always wins. Why? Because every square your king controls matters. Your king can support pawns, block enemy pawns, attack weaknesses, create threats. An inactive king does none of those things. One of the biggest mistakes club players make is leaving their king hiding in the corner while the rest of the board empties out. The moment the position becomes safe, start activating your king. Think of it this way. In the endgame, your king is no longer a piece you protect. It's a piece you use. Opposition now. Let's look at one of the most important concepts in king and pawn endgames. Opposition. The idea sounds complicated. The reality is surprisingly simple. Imagine two kings standing directly across from each other with one square between them. Neither king wants to move. Why? Because moving gives ground to the opponent. In many king and pawn endgames, whoever is forced to move first loses control of critical squares. That single move changes everything. You can have two positions that look absolutely identical. The only difference is whose turn it is. One side wins, the other draws. That's how powerful opposition can be. When players first learn this concept, it feels almost unfair. Nothing changed except the move order. But that's exactly the point. Endgames are often decided by tiny details, and opposition teaches one of the most important lessons in chess. Sometimes space is more valuable than material. Rule of the square. Here's one of the fastest endgame tools you'll ever learn. The rule of the square. Imagine a lone pawn racing toward promotion. The enemy king is far away. Can the king catch it? Many players start calculating. Don't. There's a shortcut. Draw an imaginary square from the pawn to its promotion square. If the enemy king is inside that square, the king can catch the pawn. If the king is outside, the pawn promotes. That's it. One glance. Instant answer. No long calculation. No guesswork. Strong players use this rule constantly because it allows them to evaluate positions almost instantly. And in practical games, speed matters. The faster you recognize winning or drawing positions, the more confident your decisions become. Rook. Behind the pawn. Now, let's talk about rooks. There's a famous rule every chess player should know. Rooks belong behind passed pawns, both yours and your opponent's. Why? Because rooks become stronger when they operate from behind. Imagine a rook sitting directly in front of its own pawn. The pawn blocks the rook. The rook blocks the pawn. Neither piece is helping the other. Now place that rook behind the pawn. Suddenly every pawn move creates more space. The rook gains activity. The pawn gains support. Both pieces improve together. This principle appears in countless rook endgames. If you remember nothing else about rook endings, remember this. Put your rook behind the passed pawn. Wrong color bishop. Here's one of the strangest drawing mechanisms in chess. The wrong color bishop. Imagine your opponent has a bishop and a rook pawn. Normally that should be enough to win. Except sometimes it isn't. If the bishop controls squares opposite the promotion square, the defending king can simply sit in the corner. The bishop cannot force it away. The pawn cannot promote. and the position becomes an automatic draw. Many players spend dozens of moves trying to win these positions before realizing they're impossible. The key is simple. Look at the promotion square. Look at the bishop. If the bishop doesn't control that square, remember the corner. The defending king may be completely safe. Pawn breakthroughs. Some positions look completely dead. Locked pawns. No open files. No obvious progress. Then suddenly, everything explodes. This is the power of the pawn breakthrough. A breakthrough happens when you sacrifice pawns to create a passed pawn that cannot be stopped. At first glance, the idea seems ridiculous. Why would you willingly give away material? Because sometimes pawns are worth more dead than alive. One sacrifice forces a capture, a second sacrifice creates a weakness, and suddenly a completely new pawn slips through. What looked equal becomes winning. These patterns appear over and over in practical games. But here's the catch. They only work when every pawn is on the correct square. Move one pawn a single square too far. The entire idea collapses. That's why strong players constantly look for hidden pawn breakthroughs before making routine moves. Philidor and Lucina. If there's one rook endgame, every serious player should know. It's this pair, Philidor and Lucina. Philidor is the most important drawing technique. Lucina is the most important winning technique. Together, they form the foundation of rook endings. In Philidor, the defender uses distance and active checking to prevent the attacking king from making progress. The position looks dangerous, but accurate defense holds. Lucina is the opposite. The attacker builds a bridge. The rook shields the king from checks. The king advances. The pawn promotes, and the game is won. What makes these positions so important isn't how often they appear exactly. It's how many other rook endgames resemble them. Learn Philidor and Lucina, and dozens of other positions suddenly become easier to understand. Zugzwang. Now we reach one of the most beautiful ideas in chess. Zugzwang, a German word that means being forced to move. Most players assume having the move is an advantage. Usually, it is, but not always. Sometimes every legal move makes your position worse. You don't want to move. You have to move, and that's exactly why you lose. In many king and pawn endings, the winning side isn't trying to attack immediately. They're trying to force their opponent into zugzwang. Once that happens, the position collapses on its own. It's one of the most elegant concepts in chess. Winning without attacking. Winning because your opponent is forced to act. Queen Viser's pawn on the 7th. This endgame looks easy. A queen versus a pawn. Surely the queen wins. Not always. Certain pawns on the 7th rank create surprising stalemate traps. The defending king hides beside the pawn. The attacking queen has to be extremely careful. One careless move, and the game ends immediately. The winning technique usually begins by forcing the defending king away from the pawn. Only then can the queen finish the job safely. Many players underestimate these positions because the material advantage looks overwhelming. But chess doesn't care about appearances. Technique matters. Knight versus bishop players constantly ask which piece is stronger, knight or bishop. The answer is usually neither. The position decides. Knights love closed positions. Bishops love open positions. A knight surrounded by blocked pawns can become a monster. A bishop with open diagonals can dominate the entire board. The real lesson isn't about the pieces themselves. It's about planning. The structure you create today determines which piece becomes stronger tomorrow. In many endgames, you're not playing the position in front of you. You're living with decisions you made 10 moves earlier. Triangulation. Finally, we arrive at one of the most subtle endgame ideas. Triangulation. Imagine a position where moving is bad. You want your opponent to move instead. How do you do that? You waste a move, but you do it without losing ground. The king takes a longer route to reach the same destination. 3 moves instead of 2. A triangle instead of a straight line. Nothing changes except whose turn it is, and sometimes that's enough to win the game. World champions have used this idea repeatedly, not because it looks flashy, because it works. Triangulation is the ultimate demonstration of how precise endgames can be. One extra move, one change in move order, 1. Winning position. Conclusion: most chess players spend countless hours studying openings. They memorize move sequences, they learn traps, they chase theoretical advantages. Then, the game reaches an endgame, and suddenly, all that preparation disappears. The players who consistently win aren't always the ones who know more openings. They're the ones who understand what happens after the pieces come off the board. King activity. Opposition. The rule of the square. Rooks behind passed pawns. Wrong color bishops. Pawn breakthroughs. Philidor, Lucena, Zugzwang. Queen versus pawn. Knight versus bishop. Triangulation. Master these ideas, and you'll understand more endgames than most club players ever do. Because in chess, the final moves often matter more than the first ones. And sometimes the difference between a draw and a win is just knowing what the board is trying to tell you.